And in response to the president's consistent threat of tariffs, conservative leader Pierre Poilievre urged Trump to reconsider, arguing that the U.S. is on the verge of losing the greatest trading partner they've ever had.
We'll make sure that businesses have the cash they need, the liquidity required to pay their bills and keep people working. Our goal is to keep people working through this trade dispute. And furthermore, we need to retaliate against the Americans targeting goods we don't need, can make ourselves, or get elsewhere, so we maximize the impact on them while minimizing the impact on ourselves. Then I will present President Trump with a choice. Either you start a trade war with America's closest friend and neighbor, which will weaken both our economies, rendering our continent more vulnerable to risks from abroad, or you knock down the trade barriers, we trade more as two separate sovereign nations, we enrich both sides of the border, allowing us to spend massively on our military, so that both Canada and the U.S. separately, but cooperating together, are stronger, safer, and richer. I believe, presented with that choice, particularly as they get closer to midterm elections, I think that the Americans will, in the end, be forced to reverse these disastrous tariff policies. But we can't rely on the Americans to determine our economic destiny. Your question, it contains in it the problem. Why is it that after the lost Liberal decade, we are so dependent on the Americans for everything?
And with that long-standing trading relationship on the brink of collapsing, we thought it might be worthwhile to take a step back and look at Canada's history of free trade and the importance of continued free trade moving forward. Joining us now to discuss the history and importance of free trade is Brendan Caldwell, director at Caldwell Securities Ltd. Brendan, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. So we've gone from often talking about what young people should do to a topic that I actually would know something about, which is history, simply because when I was young, it's what we called current affairs.
Well, let's talk about the history. When did free trade begin in Canada?
Well, I mean, leaving aside the whole period before the First World War and the elections that were fought around that I was not around for. But I was around for the Shamrock Summit between Ronald Reagan and Brian Mulroney in the 80s, where first off, there was a Canada-US free trade agreement that was negotiated in the 80s, and the 88 election was fought around that. Brian Mulroney and his government was returned with a large majority, affirming that Canada was very much in favor of free trade. I think the first US-Canada free trade agreement came into effect beginning of 1989. And then in the early 90s, maybe 94, Mexico was added to that, to the North American Free Trade Agreement, which has been the largest trading agreement in the history of the world. It's bigger than anything that's ever existed. I know I'm sounding like the president right now, but it really is. If he wants to talk about huge, massive, important, this is, I mean, the Canada-US trading relationship is the largest two-country trading relationship that's ever existed in the history of the world.
Now, you believe that free trade has been good for everyone worldwide. Tell us how.
It's been good for hundreds of millions and probably billions of people. When I was young, there were a lot more tariffs in the world. Now that I'm older, 40 years of increasingly free trade has been instrumental in lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. I mean, when I was young, East Asia were developing countries. Now they are, if not first world countries, darn close. Japan is, totally a developed country. China has come very far along since being brought into the World Trade Organization. Vietnam, India has hundreds of millions of people have joined the middle class in India over the last decades, and all of that has been attributable to a more closely tied trading relationship. And I do think it's good for the world, if for no other reason that, and it may seem twirly mustached Disney villain, but if you're doing business with somebody, if you have an economic relationship with somebody, if you're getting goods and services from somebody, or if somebody's paying you for your goods and services, you care that they're doing well. Where there are countries where we don't have economic relationships, like much of Africa, the developed world, from the time of Romeo Dallaire to the present, hasn't nearly cared as much about sub-Saharan Africa because we don't have trading relationships with them. And that's been part of Africa's tragedy. So to the extent that countries are able to join the organization, the world community of trading nations, their countries have been better off, Canada included.
And amid all the uncertainty of when the tariff war will end and the extent of its ramifications, small businesses are worried about losing customers due to having to adjust their prices. What advice do you have for them?
Well, I think according to Mr. Polyev, it's not a trade war, it's a trade dispute. We're having a trade dispute with the Americans, which might be probably worthwhile in downgrading the rhetoric. We've always felt that small business should have some money set aside from their business. Because there are crises and there are opportunities, and this is going to be both. There's going to be danger and there's going to be an opportunity in this moment, because there will be businesses that go under as a result of this. We are very dependent on U.S. trade. We need to be less dependent. And hopefully there will be a transition both between more interprovincial trade and more international offshore trade. But in that transition, there will be casualties. So now and forever in the future, businesses should set aside a little bit of money just so they can have reserves. If nothing else, it helps them to think more clearly when crises pop up or when opportunities present themselves.
Now, beyond international tariffs, interprovincial trade barriers continue to make it difficult for businesses to operate across Canada. Now, there's talk that they'll be dropped by July 1st. What are the biggest obstacles to free trade between provinces, and what can be done to remove them?
Well, you can't say the word provincial without the word province embedded in them. So Canada was founded with the notion that this nation, to borrow from Hamilton, would be a viable, united entity to provide an alternate North American vision of what the future could be like to what the United States has to offer. To say that we are a unique nation by virtue of the fact we're not American, I think it's a fair statement, because there's an awful lot about us that is just different in terms of the value between Toronto to Vancouver to Montreal to Victoria. We actually have more in common in what we think is important. So to borrow from Quebec, who wanted long ago to be maîtres chez nous, to be masters in our own house, we have been so reliant on the Americans. To be masters in our own house, we have to be a house united. Because as some carpenter out of Nazareth said, a house divided cannot stand. So the barriers between moving professions interprovincially, between moving goods interprovincially, needs to come down. There has to be a much more fluid dynamic between the provinces, so we don't think of ourselves provincially, but think of ourselves as a nation.
Well, Brendan, thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you, Theresa.